Hi everyone, we're back and we're going to be speaking about the translation movement in the Abbasid Empire. I've already recorded a bit of an introduction to this, but now we're going to get into the meat of the topic. So let's start off with something more interesting. We're going to talk about the time the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun tried to open the pyramid of Khufu. That's the big one, the biggest pyramid, which is now outside of Giza, basically outside of Cairo. He was cracking it open, but what was he looking for? Why was he so obsessed with the Pyramid of Giza? Well, if you know anything about pyramids, you know that there's probably some hieroglyphs around there. And what he was actually looking for was secret knowledge of the ancients. By this point, of course, the pyramids were quite old. No one quite knew what exactly they were, but they were clearly possessing ancient knowledge, and he wanted to get at it. And he actually ended up opening the pyramid. This is a description from a geography of his exploration. It says inside the pyramid were passages leading up and down, others leading up, others leading down, all of them terrifying appearance, difficult to get through. These passages led up to a cubical room, 8 by 8 cubits in size. In the middle of the room was a basin made of marble. When the top was broken off, nothing was found inside but the decayed human remains. And at that point, the caliph put an end to the expedition. So I don't know what he was expecting to find in there, probably ancient books or something like that. But it seems like what he ended up doing is actually basically cracking into this side, basically drilling a hole through this part, going inside and finding the different passages leading eventually to the burial chamber, at which point they found the sarcophagus and realizing nothing was left by this point. Long time robbed by grave robbers, giving up and moving on. But that desire to translate ancient sciences remains. By the way, the hieroglyphics weren't only, of course, translated into modern languages in 1799 when the Rosetta Stone was discovered. But there was many other attempts like that of Ma'mun to try to access that ancient sciences, which they saw not as descriptions of ancient world. They weren't just in for historical purposes. They thought that it was going to give them access to classical knowledge, true knowledge of the ancients. And this idea of accessing that knowledge of the ancients, of the people that came before him, is one of the reasons why the translation movement took off in the Abbasid Empire. And one of the people one of the reasons why Al-Ma'mun was one of its main patrons, starting around hitting the high point in the kind of 830s and so forth. So remember, what is the translation movement? It's an extended movement from about 750 to 950, kind of hitting the high point in the 800s, late 800s, with all sorts of scientific and philosophical texts. Syriac, Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, but particularly ancient Greek works were translated into Arabic. Now, that was just one part, as I pointed out, of this larger canon formation which created Islamic civilization, and then also coincided with the development of the religious sciences and literature. But we're going to be talking about the translation movement itself, and we're looking at basically what was actually being translated. And there's really three main areas here: astrology, geometry, and dialectics. Those are the sum of what is actually being transformed at that time. Now we're going to get more into it. But first, we have to think about, well, what is it? Why were they? Okay, everyone wanted ancient knowledge, but what is it about the Abbasids that sparked that desire to translate material? Why didn't the Umayyads do it? Did later people not do it? Well, I think part of it is because the Abbasids really embodied in many ways the Sasanian ideals of rulership. Who were the Sasanians, or the previous Iranian kingdom or dynasty that ruled in the same area that the Sasanians had as their power base, right? So Iraq and Iran. And of course, they took on many of the same ideas about kingship, about legitimacy, and of course, many of the same practices. We already saw this from the very beginning. For example, the fact that in the early Islamic period, The coins that they were using, of course, were modeled on the Sasanian models, and so the first Islamic coins actually had the Sasanian ruler and a fire temple depicted on it. But at the same time, there's a lot of people, descendants of former Sasanian subjects, who spoke in Persian, who still saw these forms of imperial legitimacy as important, and especially in Khorasan and Marv, which were the power bases of the Abbasids. So one of the ideas here is that the Abbasid caliphs tried to embody this idea of a Sasanian ruler who possesses all knowledge, and especially he collects all the different types of knowledge in the world, especially ancient knowledge, and puts it together in like a giant book. Now, there's other ideas too. For example, that maybe it was courtiers competing against each other in the Abbasid court that went out and pushed these translations. But it seems like perhaps the ideal of the Sasanian ruler was a more convincing one. Now, apparently, one of the things that they did, Abbasid caliphs did to do this, is create an institution called the Beit al-Hikmah, which essentially was a giant research institute. It sort of had a large library and a team. This is pictures how they imagined it, books and people going around debating with globes and stuff like that. Now, in all likelihood, there was no actual building. Books, by the way, were never stacked this way, and it wasn't just like an open library in any way. It probably didn't look anything like this in any way, if it actually even was a physical place rather than a sort of generic institution. But they did invest a lot of money and time in translating this and supporting this work, and it was often done through their courtiers, the people, not directly, the people working for the Abbasid Caliph, who were pushing and developing these ideas and paying people to translate that material. So again, what were they looking at though? Astrology, geometry, and math, and then dialectics, logic, and it kind of came in that order. And it all started around the year 750 with the new Abbasid realm under the Caliph al-Mansur. And of course, the very first priority is astrology. Astrology is the science of understanding how the stars affect human behavior, how they affect medicine, how they affect a whole variety of other things. Because of course, the stars, in this case, the planets, are constantly affecting the sphere below, which is our base sphere. And so you would need to understand where the stars are and how they work. And so already from the very beginning, astrology was incredibly important to the Abbasids. The very fact that astrologers were consulted, Zoroastrian and Jewish astrologer apparently were consulted on the very construction and plan of Baghdad and what date it should be founded upon. Those astrological works, especially from Persian and some Greek works, were some of the first things that were translated, including basic astronomical position charts from Sanskrit and Persian. Those basically help you figure out where the planets are in the sky, so you can predict more correctly what is the astrological coincidences at that time. So building upon this, it was a very important work of astrology by a figure named Abu Mash'ar, died in 886, who wrote about this. And of course, this basically is clear has an important royal purpose or individual purpose. But of course, the Abbasid ruler wants to make sure that he's doing everything right in the right times according to astrological projections. So it makes sense that this is kind of the first useful thing that was translated. But then there's other things that started being translated that just needed to be developed in order to govern an increasingly complex empire. So for example, astronomy was translated not only for astrological purposes, but also because they needed to figure out prayer times. So there's 5 prayers in the Muslim in the Muslim 5 daily required prayers, but they're not exactly at the same time, right? They're based off of the the dawn, dusk, right? So what that means is that to predict when that prayer is going to be and what time is the right, when the sun is in the right position, etc., you have to know some basics about astronomy. More importantly, to collect taxes, to understand the basics of inheritance law. All of this stuff required large amounts of algebra and geometry to basically survey land and to figure out inheritances, bequests, tax assessments, legal verdicts, commercial transactions, land surveying, water rights, and handasa. All this stuff needed basically complex mathematics. And so some of that things were translated from Greek into Arabic and then developed even further in Arabic. So one of those people that develops al-jabra, which is from the word al-jabar in Arabic, is a figure known as Khwarizmi. So Khwarizmi is from an area called Kharazm, basically between Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan today, which was a very important space of intellectual learning and so forth. He basically develops a system of algebra using actually a geometrical conceptualization to think through it. And you can look on the left here about how they did it. And they used it for also, I mean, all sorts of different types of problems. For example, they needed to figure out the size of the earth. This was another attempt by the Caliph al-Ma'mun, the same guy who tried to break into the pyramid to kind of solve these big scientific questions, right? Al-Ma'mun is a sort of scholar caliph. He's very interested in these moments of large expedition. And so one of the things that they do is basically they knew that the earth was round, but they didn't know how big it was. So they basically understood, well, if we can figure out how long one small part of it is, so that part here, and then if you can understand the angle, you can basically guess how long it would be. And so what the people in the ancient world did is essentially try to guess from there. This was also done, by the way, by the ancient Greeks, but Al-Ma'mun redoes this. And it comes out actually to pretty much, well, let's say a few thousand kilometers off, but not wildly incorrect, right? So they were able to understand how big the Earth was at that time. So to do that sort of material, to do that sort of geometry and basic stuff, they're translating math, but they're also translating aspects of the physics. They're translating Euclid's elements and so forth to do this sort of material. The third priority was basically logic and metaphysics, and this was used in these courtly debates called kalam debates. Kalam means word or discourse, but what here means basically another word for kind of theology or philosophy. So the caliph and the governors would host these kind of formalized debates between Christian priests or bishops and Muslim thinkers. And often it turns out that the Muslims would lose on these theological questions because the Christians were much better trained in formal philosophy and analytical reasoning, etc. And so they kind of realized, well, we need to be reading what they're reading. So they translated aspects of Aristotle's topics and works on logic into Arabic. So this is where you get also, again, the physics of Aristotle being translated to get a notion of metaphysics and how to argue. All of this coming together over time to create a large corpus and knowledge about ancient Greece and to a lesser degree about ancient Iran in that period. Now, who is actually doing that translation? Well, interestingly enough, it's not Muslim converts, it's actually Christians and other non-Muslim scholars who had a foot in both worlds. They knew Arabic, but they also probably knew Syriac and Greek. And in fact, most of what they're translating is not from Greek directly, but from Syriac. Okay, so there are people like this guy, very famous, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a name son of Ishaq, the entire family called the Bakhtishu family of Nestorian Christians. Some people who are Sabians, which are sort of other type of monotheistic religion around a figure named Thabit bin Qura, and also the Zoroastrians, which is the Banu Munajim. Munajim is a word for astrologer, right? So this is the astrologer brothers family. These people were often patronized and put in charge of these worlds of translation. And in fact, what they did is often sometimes even go over to the Byzantine Empire, looking for more text to translate, getting other copies, getting the most correct information that they could. One of the interesting people here is this figure, Thabit ibn Qurra. He was a Sabian, which again was a type of monotheistic religion that doesn't exist anymore, but exists at that time, from the area of Haran. Haran is today in Turkey, right on the Syrian border. You can go visit the ruins. There's some nomads living in the middle of the ruins. And he's basically working in Syriac, which was the major language of Christians and of the population at that time in that region. He's translating Ptolemy, Archimedes, Euclid, Apollonius, a whole variety of different people. One of the interesting things, though, he attained a great deal of fame and power in the Abbasid court. And his descendants kept working and translating for generations. But the interesting thing is they never converted. They always stayed Sabian. Now, why is that? I think it's partially because, as some people argue, it's because that exoticism, the fact that he wasn't Muslim, that he wasn't Arab, I think lent credence to his translations. Just as in some cases, if, for example, if you're abroad, if you have an American doctor or so forth, or if you go to the American hospital or the British hospital, it seems like you're getting better medicine. That may or may not be true, but it's that sort of same sense of foreignness as legitimacy that is carried over here. Now, not everything was translated. So, for instance, Greek histories, plays, certain parts of the rhetoric, none of this material made it over. Now, part of that is not just the fault of, it's not just a question of interest, it's also that some of this material just wasn't around, was no longer in circulation by that period. So the Greek histories and a lot of plays, tragedies, etc., had stopped being performed in this period, and therefore were just not readily available. But work like Euclid and work on dialectics and other things like that, that material is still around, and therefore it was being translated into Arabic. Now, there's a question here: how were these translations actually made? What did they actually do? Well, there is some description of what is going on here. So here's Hunayn ibn Ishaq describing his method. So he says he's translating Galen. Galen is the foundational figure for medicine. If you ever heard of Galenic medicine, it comes from the name Galen, and that material comes from Greek into Arabic and then eventually back into Latin. So he says the first 6 books of this work were translated into Syriac by Sergius, but he was a very weak translator. He became a better translator. He translated the next 8 books. So then he basically says, okay, there's already a weak translation out there. Now I'm going back, I'm going to do a new translation. Translated the work from the beginning of the Bukhtishu, for Bukhtishu ibn Jabir, one of the famous people, translating families. So it basically goes through, he gets a bunch of different Greek manuscripts that he had. He collates them, that means he compares them. He figures out a single correct copy from that, then he translates it, and then he changes the style, and then he brings the Arabic up to snuff. And then he keeps looking for more manuscripts, right? Because they don't have a lot of copies of these books out there. So they keep looking and looking for more material, and they try to find it and to supplement it so they can come up with better translations. This is a figure, Al-Safadi, writing much later, but he's writing about what they were doing. Also thinking about kind of what's the nature of their translation process. Translator studies each individual. You can basically study, you can give a literal translation, or you can try to give the overall sense and meaning. And that is the method that people like Hunayn ibn Ishaq and al-Jawhari used, right? They understand the whole thing, and then they render it into Arabic. They don't just try to do everything literally, because that gives you a bad translation. But then you get an issue of how do you translate concepts? How do you translate ideas that might have existed in the ancient Greek world that don't exist anymore, or that don't even have that concept, right? So of course, for example, let's take an example, I don't know, democracy or something like that. That's a concept, or economy. Those are concepts that don't exist in the past. So if people in the past somehow came across those ideas and tried to even conceptualize them, they couldn't, because that idea just doesn't exist. So they would have to sit there and explain it and do all sorts of stuff. What would happen if they came across that they weren't fully aware of? There's a famous Argentinian author, Jorge Luis Borges, who actually considered that, right? He's an amazing writer of little short stories. I highly recommend you read Borges. Borges wrote a book called Averroes Search. Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, was a famous philosopher working in Spain. And he thought about the fact, well, what happens in this story? Averroes encounters the Greek word for tragedy, right? Tragedy as a type of play, tragedy as this, but that concept, because it was never translated into Arabic, it didn't exist. So how was he supposed to think through it? Could he have even had that concept? What would he have done without that concept, right? So translation is more than just literally changing the meaning. It's about bringing entire new ideas into play as you translate from one culture to another, from one time period to another. Last but not least, I do wanted to speak briefly about this translation movement and its overall impact. So this translation movement moved and preserved a lot of stuff from Greek into Arabic, and in fact from there it then developed even further in Arabic. One of the interesting points is that because of this, Arabic was seen as the preserver of the classical heritage. And so when Europeans wanted to understand what ancient Greeks were writing, or Roman writings, they basically turned to the Arabic. And so they translated material from Arabic back into Latin, or they translated new material from Arabic into Latin. So people like Averroes, or Ibn Rushd, or Ar-Razi, or Avicenna, Ibn Sina, get translated into Latin. Now, mostly happened in Spain, mostly in the 13th century. In fact, you can see it here. From 1250 to 1350, there's a second translation movement where material from Arabic comes into Latin from Spain and France. And so this kind of classical Greek knowledge comes back to Europe. Now, it turns out later on, Europeans become so obsessed with this that they start looking for the original Greek texts and then comparing, trying to find them, etc., which they do to some degree. But Arabic holds an important part. And so all of these classic Islamic authors, people like Ibn Sina, become known in the Latin canon as Avicenna. Ibn Rushd becomes Averroes. Al-Razi becomes Razes. And so one of the interesting points, though, here's a depiction of Razi in a medieval translation of his work about medicine, is that actually the idea of Arabs as having a particular sense of medical and scientific expertise becomes widespread in 13th and 14th century. In fact, some medieval Europeans, to get their ideas taken seriously, wrote under fake Arab names. Now, what you can see here is kind of a continuation, just like how early translators in the era of Abbasid court continued to keep their non-Muslim origins to remain exotic and to keep legitimacy. In the European case, a few centuries later, what you have is actually the opposite, people pretending to be Arab to have legitimate knowledge. ultimately what would happen, especially but from the Byzantine Empire, a whole variety of Greek texts would flow into Europe, into places like Italy in the 1400s, and then also after the conquest by the Ottomans, and that would spur a new moment of examination of these original texts in the Greek classical heritage. But all of this comes together in a few different translation movements, and the big one under the Abbasids.